On July 26, 1949, a mob of hundreds of white men tracked down and shot Ernest Thomas, a 26-year-old black man, over 400 times while he was asleep under a tree in Madison County, Florida. 2 days after being killed by a mob, a coroner's jury ruled that Thomas's death was a justifiable homicide. Ernest Thomas was one of the so-called Groveland Four, 3 young black men and one 16-year-old black boy, who in 1949 were falsely accused of raping 17-year-old Norma Paget and assaulting her husband in Groveland, Florida. On July 16, 1949, 2 young black men, Samuel Shepard and Walter Irvin, and one 16-year-old black boy, Charles Greenlee, were captured and manheld on charges of assaulting Mrs. Paget. Within hours of the accusations, mobs of white residents burned their homes and properties of black families in Groveland. They were taken to Lee County Jail, where they were tortured by the police. The next day, a mob of at least 100 white men formed outside of the jail and demanded that the 3 men be released to them. Unable to access their intended targets, the heavily armed white mob went on a rampage of racial terror in Groveland's black neighborhoods, where they shot at residents and set fire to their homes. By the hundreds, the black community fled Groveland, fearing for their lives. Thomas had evaded capture by the mob and fled too. The mob pursued him for 10 days straight before they finally caught up to him and shot him to death while he was sleeping. Despite being beaten into giving false confessions and the state failing to present crucial evidence, such as a medical examination of Norma Paget, the 3 survivors of this violence remained incarcerated and were wrongly convicted by an all-white jury. Charles Greenlee was sentenced to life in prison, while Irvin and Shepard, both 22, were sentenced to death. In 1951, after the work of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, U.S. Supreme Court overturned Irvin's and Shepard's convictions, stating they were entitled to a new trial. Before the trials could take place, Sheriff McCall shot both Irvin and Shepard while they were handcuffed together in his custody and being transferred from prison. Shepard died, but Irvin, who was shot and was denied an ambulance because he was black, he survived. Irvin was then convicted again by an all-white jury in his retrial and was sentenced to death. Nearing his execution date, Irvin received a stay before finally having his sentence commuted and being released from prison in 1968. He died a year later. Charles Greenlee remained on a life sentence and was released on parole in 1962. He died on April 18, 2012. No charges were ever filed against any of the white law enforcement officers or members of the mob who were active participants in this racial terror. Sheriff McCall, who was infamous for using violence to enforce segregation and terrorize the black community, claimed he acted in self-defense in shooting Irvin and Shepard, even though they were handcuffed. Not only was he cleared of all charges, but he was also reelected as sheriff on 5 subsequent occasions. All 4 of these men were posthumously pardoned by the governor of Florida in 2019.